Well, I emigrated from this city 16 years ago and moved to first London, then Scotland. But over 20 years ago, we were right here when the Anne Lovett, Lavinia Kerwick, the X case, the Kilkenny Insects case provoked and politicised tens of thousands of women. And I, as a young teenager, was politicised and became very involved in the campaigns for women's rights at that point in time. What an absolute disgrace that over 20 years later we're still having to stand on these feckin' streets to demand the right for the women's right to choose in this country. It's shameful and it needs to end now. In Scotland, my first job was working at a women's aid refuge. And within my first few months, there was a young woman with 2 young children had come into refuge, left her home, her belongings, everything to come into refuge. Her kids were under the age of 3. And she found out within a few weeks of being in refuge that she was pregnant, and she couldn't go through with the pregnancy again because she was homeless. She just couldn't have faced it. But within 2 weeks of seeing her GP, she'd had a termination. The other women in the refuge rallied around her, looked after her kids, looked after her, and she got emotional support. Jesus, it really brought it home to me. That could not have happened in this country. You would have had to try and scramble together the hundreds of euro, travel on your own. She'd no family. Who would have looked after her kids while she was needing to travel? She would not have had the choice that she had. And I tell you, when I mention to my colleagues now, they cannot believe that in 21st century, that Ireland still does not have the legal right for the woman's right to choose over an abortion. It is absolutely shameful. Now, in terms of the general issues of rape and sexual abuse, we had our 1 billion rise and flash mob. We were dancing in Dundee. I didn't do the dancing, but all around the world, women took to the streets to actually talk about the fact and oppose the fact that 1 billion women around the world experience some form of gender-based violence, rape, sexual abuse, domestic abuse. 1 billion women. Now that is absolutely shameful. In my city in Dundee, in the last 3 months, it was revealed in the newspapers, there's been a 70% rise in the number of women reporting having been raped. Yet at the same time, our funding has been cut. As I stand, we still don't know what our funding will be come the 1st of April. Now, this is the reality of austerity in Scotland, the reality of austerity in this country, that absolutely essential services that are there, that need to be there for the support of women to be able to live lives free from domestic abuse or escape violence, but also about the provision of, for example, women who come to our service, many are survivors of childhood sexual abuse, over half of the women who come. You're talking about post-traumatic stress, severe anxiety, complex mental health needs. Thankfully, we have the NHS, which is free at the point of access in Scotland, that you can get medical treatment. I know women in this country who do not have the same rights, that it costs them hundreds of euros to go and see a doctor to get prescribed antidepressants, where they wait for months to actually get to see a counsellor or a psychologist to recover, or you have to travel hundreds of miles to get support from a rape crisis centre in this city. The other things that are absolutely imperative in terms of supporting women to have the choice to live a life free from violence is, if you're in an abusive relationship, you should be able to leave and get a new home. But you require housing in order to actually have an alternative housing, and that, if you do not have that, then you are condemned to stay in a violent relationship, or at the very least, access to emergency accommodation. These are key questions in terms of linking up the issues of violence against women to the day-to-day struggles of demanding the right to housing, the right to a decent living wage, so that money never becomes an issue, whether you need help in terms of fleeing abuse or whether you need to go and seek support because you're fleeing gender-based violence. Now, the last point I want to make is in relation to the recent revelations around childhood sexual exploitation, which is a huge issue now in the UK, coming from the Rotherham report, the Jimmy Savile experiences and so on. Now, in where I work, we have what's called a prevention programme, and we are going into schools. But across the whole of Scotland, there's 11 part-time workers whose job it is to go into schools, to try and talk to young people, to try and undo the damage of an increase in pornification that's happening within our societies, where we're grooming young men and young women to actually to think that for a young man it's acceptable and it's normalised to watch porn. For young women it's acceptable and actually you're groomed to be sharing photos and images and behave in certain ways. But when we get in, actually it's incredible the difference that we make. But 11 part-time workers, again, investment in education to go in and support young people to talk about what's actually happening to them without the input of any church, by the way, within that, because that's been something we've had to fight the few kind of Catholic schools that do exist in Dundee to actually get in and talk about these issues of what is consent, what is a healthy relationship, you know, and sexualisation of young people and so on. So the last point I will make, and I think whilst we've a hell of a long way to go, I think the protest here today shows that there is an increasing willingness of men and women to stand up, to organise together, to fight sexism, to fight for equal rights, to defend the right for the woman's right to choose. Only last summer, 2 women in Glasgow, 2 women who'd had enough of feeling afraid to walk home at night because of the increased numbers of rapes in the south side of Glasgow, they decided to organise a demonstration called These Streets Are Made for Walking at midnight in Glasgow. 5,000 people, young men and women together, walked through the south side of Glasgow to say no, we defend the right for women to be safe on our streets. We've had the Page 3 campaign, which has been extremely successful in getting rid of the selling of magazines in universities and stuff like that. That's where it becomes really important to continue to have these kind of demonstrations, but also have an international coordinated action as well, so that in Scotland we support you in your struggle to defend the right, or not defend, to actually get the right for the woman's right to choose within this country. So thank you for inviting me, and well done for everybody for showing up.